Okay, Dean, if you're ready to roll, you got a quorum and it's just after 1 o'clock.
All right. Okay, we'd like to welcome everybody here to our meeting today. We've got a quorum. Let me bring up my agenda here for just a second, and then we'll.
Okay, first item, Mr. Chairman, would be introductions and attendance. And I will read off the committee members and other water board members that are in attendance, and then Jennifer will make sure to note down who else is in attendance. So for committee members, I have Dean Stevenson, chairman of the committee. I've got, let's see, Al Barker, I've got Brian Olmstead and Pat McMahon. And then I saw, let's see, Jeff Raybould, Mark Gibbs, and Joanne Cole-Hansen as other water board members attending the committee meeting. Did not see Dale Van Stone. If you're on, Dale, give me a holler. And then Jennifer will mark down who else is in attendance.
All right. I guess let's start off with our first item.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, first item will be an update on the Eastern Snake Plain Aquifer storage change. As you know, this is a presentation that we do every year to track storage change in the aquifer over the last year. And Mike McVeigh from our hydrology group will lead off with that presentation.
Thanks, Brian. Let's see if I can get this going. All right, I think we're ready to go. Can everybody see that? I think we're good to go.
Yes.
All right, well, thanks for letting me be here today. We're going to talk about storage changes in the ESPA, somewhat of a sensitive topic in my world. As Ryan said, my name is Mike. I work in the hydrology section, and I'm actually within the modeling group within the hydrology section. So as we get started, I know everybody online is probably pretty familiar with Southern Idaho, but I'm going to show the model, ESPA model boundary quite a bit. So I just want you to be oriented to that figure. In case you get lost, you know that Thousand Springs down here at the lower left, Henry's Fork up here in the upper right, and then the fingers up in the north and the south there are Arco and Pocatello. That kind of help you keep you oriented. And if you do get lost, just let me know and we'll figure out where we are. So we are talking about storage in the aquifer, which is the aquifer water balance. It's a deceptively simple equation. Inflow minus outflow equals change in storage. It's just that those inflows and those outflows are very difficult to come by. We spend a lot of time and money and effort trying to collect them. And honestly, it can be difficult to measure and there's a time delay. So although it can be good information, it's hard to use in a real-time fashion to make decisions. So we really need something a little more efficient so that we can use changes in storage to assess the aquifer and maybe assess management or maybe guide management activities. And fortunately, we do have a more direct method of getting to storage, and that's using aquifer water level changes. And this should make sense, right? More water in the aquifer means, or in the well means more water in the aquifer, and less water in your well would mean probably less water in the aquifer. So we're going to leverage that relationship and see what we come up with. It's a pretty simple idea. I calculate water level changes at each of the wells, and then I interpolate those changes across the aquifer model boundary. So now we have a depth of change over an area of the model boundary that is a volume. That volume, however, does contain aquifer matrix as well as the water. So then I move to what we call specific yield. You can read that definition there if you really want to, but basically it's the amount of water that's available to us. So if I look at that in more of a cartoon representation, there on the left, we've got the subsurface, unsaturated on top, saturated aquifer at the bottom. Move up to the upper right, that's a piece of the aquifer. We've blown it up. Now you can see that's actually water and rock. And then if we were to let that piece of aquifer drain by gravity, all the water that's released is the water that's actually available to us. That specific yield, and it's expressed as a percentage. And in this version of the model, it's 7.5%. So now I multiply that volume that I calculated earlier by 7.5%. That effectively removes that aquifer matrix and leaves us with just the amount of water that changed in that year. So as you might expect, we're looking at changes in wells. We want a lot of wells to look at. So we depend on mass water level measurements, synoptic measurements, sometimes they're called. And what we're doing is we're going out and collecting as much information as we can in as short of a period of time as we can, because we want to get a snapshot of the aquifer. And we do this in the spring annually. We also do these 5-year increments, which I'll talk about in a bit. And we like to do them in the spring for a couple reasons. What we're doing is we're trying to integrate the impacts of the previous season's water use. So as you might expect, in areas with surface water irrigation, water levels rise over the course of the year. Groundwater irrigation, water levels drop up throughout the course of the year. And then during the winter, they either recover or recede back to some kind of resultant condition. We take our snapshot and then we compare it to earlier snapshots. And that's how we get our storage changes. So I just alluded to a second ago, these larger mass measurement events, and they occurred in 1980, 2001, 2002. And then starting in 2008, we do them every 5 years. So 8, 13, 18, and 23. So we're going to look at those and we'll compare storage over time to 1980. So before we get started, I do want to orient you. You're going to see a lot of this type of figure. So you'll always see at the top are the years that I'm comparing, 1980 to 2001 in this figure. Move down just a little bit, you'll see the volume of aquifer change that was calculated. 2 million acre-feet lost from storage in this example. The figure you're seeing is aquifer model boundary, and those colors in there are the water level changes. And so those changes, the colors are consistent through all these graphs. So the pink here is the same as the pink in the next graphics. The little black dots you see across the plane there, those are the wells that I used for the calculation. And then down at the bottom right, that's the number of wells that I was able to use in the calculation. So 1980, 2001, we lost 2 million acre-feet. It's a big loss. It's a long period of time, but still it's a big number. So let's look at 2002. That's even worse. We went 1 year and dropped 1.9 million acre-feet. We almost lost 2 million acre-feet in 1 year. So I started doing this in 2012. At the time, I gave just these 2 years. I don't know if you know Terry Euling. He was the old chair. I'd never seen him angry. He didn't look very happy when I did this. Asked me to go back and do more. And of course, I come back with more bad news. So 1980, 2008, we're down 6 million acre-feet. So we're kind of showing this story over time where we're just dropping significant volumes of water over time. Move to 2013, we've now gone to 7.5 million acre-feet in the hole. 2018, we've climbed out of this terrible abyss into a very deep hole. Now we're at 6.5 million acre-feet. So we had some good years in there, but we haven't overcome our issues. And then we moved to our most recent, which was this spring, and we've lost 9.3 million acre-feet since 1980. Okay, so I'm showing a fairly consistent picture of water levels and aquifer volume going down over time. It's good information to know, I think, but it's also somewhat unsatisfactory. We've just got this high-level view of a long-term issue. It's not really usable for making decisions. It's definitely not usable for assessing the things that we're doing or the things we want to do. So in fact, we do measure hundreds of wells every spring just as part of our long-term monitoring of the aquifer. And so in the past, those measurements just kind of occurred in the springtime sometime, whenever we could get out there and whenever things were available, because we're just doing this long-term monitoring, seeing what's happening. However, this has become much more important. We started doing some special things. So in 2016, we started collecting the springtime measurements, the annual measurements on the same time frame of those larger synoptic measurements that we just looked at. So that way things are kind of tightened up a little bit, and maybe we're looking at things one-to-one and we can compare them more directly. Now I'm starting at 2015. I don't want to show you every year from 1980, but in 2015, things changed for us. 2016, managed aquifer recharge really took off in earnest. The settlement agreement activity started in 2016. So this is a good baseline to help us assess what's going on since we started really trying to manage the aquifer. So we look at 15 to 16, we lost 300,000 acre feet in storage. Now we started doing stuff in 16, but this is very early in the year and those things hadn't actually occurred yet. So we're probing what happened in 2015 more than we are in 2016. So this shouldn't be a surprise. We moved to 16 and 17, things have gone up quite a bit, 800,000 acre feet. That's very nice. But if you remember, that was the super winter. We were expecting a big change and this number actually resulted in kind of a thud around. I myself, we were a little bit disappointed with such a banner water year. Why didn't we gain more? And I mean, in the past, we've lost almost 2 million acre feet in a year. And I think if you look at the graphic here, you can see a couple of things. You see green along the periphery. So we were getting some runoff. We're getting some recharge in this area in the southwest. But then in the middle of the plain and the northeast of the plain where it's colder, I think all that water was still entrained in ice and snow, and it just hadn't been introduced to the aquifer. So we just didn't see it yet. And I think this is a good time to point out that we are comparing year to year, but things do not happen on an annual time frame. Things smear out a bit over 2 or 3 seasons. And so now we can kind of home in on that point, because in 17-18, we went up 1.6 million acre feet. We're starting to catch up from that really wet 16-17. And you can see it in the graphic, that big pink on the eastern half of the aquifer is now green. The big pink blob in the center of the plain is now green. And I think that water was introduced over the course of 2017, and we picked it up in 2018. Then we go to 18-19. I've got 30,000 acre foot loss in the aquifer. To be honest, you know, we're using wells, we're using water levels, we're interpolating over great distances. In my mind, this is kind of zero. That we held our own on this year. I don't know if we can support calling it 30,000 acre feet. I generally round to the nearest 100,000 acre feet, but since this was less than that, I didn't think zero really told us much. Now remember, you see a lot of red on there, but the previous 2 years were banner years for us. So the water levels were very high. We almost have no choice but to eventually come back down unless we have banner year after banner year. So it's not as bad as it seems right here, but things are holding steady. We had a pretty good year, 2019. We gained 400,000 acre feet over that year. However, the dry times have returned. 2020 to 21, we've lost 400,000 acre feet. 21 to 22, remember I got really dry on the end of 21. We lost 1.3 million acre feet. And then again, last year, same thing. It got just brutally dry on us toward the end, and we lost another 1 million acre feet. And so that was the last year we've looked at. We lost 1 million acre feet. It's painful, but that's where we're at. And then let's look at that long-term 15 to 23. We look at our baseline. We lost 300,000 acre feet over that time. I'll show a little bit later, but I think maybe a lot of us remember that we lose about 200,000 acre feet in aquifer storage since 1980. So if we look at that, you can say, wow, you know, 15 to 23, we're only down 300,000 acre feet. We're definitely bucking the trend over this time. And I think that's good news. And I also think the graphic shows us something here. You can see the southwest part of the aquifer is white and green, whereas the northeast part of the aquifer is still pink. And I believe we're seeing some of those impacts of recharge in the lower basin, where areas of longer retention, they stick around a little bit longer, whereas in the northeast, we kind of recharge closer to the river and things don't stay around quite as long. And I think this graphic really tells the tale. So let's put it all together. Put on my glasses so you can see this first part of the graph from 1912 to 1980. They were calculated doing the in minus out method. USGS did this. Got an operator there named Kellstrom. And then from 1980 to present, we're using the water level calculation method. And so if you kind of look here, 1980, 2001, it went down. 2001 to 2002 went down. So you can see those first graphics make sense as we keep going down through time. Then we get to 2000, let's see if I can control the mouse. 2015 is right here. We went down a little bit, 16, had our couple of great years. Now you can see that 30,000 acre feet is pretty much holding steady. And then we started dropping again the last couple of years. But now by doing this year on year, we have something we can look at. Those first graphics were important, but they didn't tell us much. Now we can see what's happening year to year. We can assess what happened with the weather, what happened with our management, and how did the aquifer respond. It tells a more complete story, and I think that's something that's very helpful. And I think that, you know, the fact that we collect so many water levels every summer is pretty impressive. And then here, the blue bars here are the calculated Thousand Springs discharge. And I like to show this because it shows that the storage in the black line related to water levels in the aquifer relate to discharge from the aquifer at Thousand Springs. And that should be that way. It's head-driven flow, more water in the aquifer, more discharge from the springs. We'll see this a couple more times in the next presentations, and they'll probably give you a little more context as to what you're seeing. But it makes us comfortable that we're calculating similar things over time. So I think it's important, this group especially needs to see what's happening with the Sentinel wells because of the settlement agreement. Throw those on top of our 2015 to 23 map. And you can see how the wells relate to what's happening in the aquifer. And it's up to somebody else to determine if that's an accurate representation for the settlement stuff. And then just throwing it on there so we can look for 1980. You can see the wells are pretty well spread over a lot of lower water levels. And that makes sense because we see lower water levels as well as lower reach gains. And, you know, water levels are important and we put a lot of effort into it. We have a lot of people here. Dennis Owsley runs our network out of the state office. They do just so much work. Neil Farmer does a lot of work too. I mean, we collect a lot of water levels. Every time they go out, they come back with more wells. It's hard to keep up. But just for an example here, here's the 15 to 16. We started doing stuff really in 16, moved to last year. That's a lot of wells. We've really filled in a gap. I mean, that is beautiful. Look at that. We are monitoring water levels. And even more importantly, we throw on the transducers. Now that's valuable right there. You know, doing a discrete measurement is good, but sometimes you just don't know what's going on in that well. And a change in water levels could be real or it could be due to something that's happening in or near that well. The transducers allow me to see what's happening over time and pick a more appropriate water level. It helps not only for those wells, but the wells around them because they help me constrain what's going on and understand which wells I should or should not use. So this is impressive. If you're not impressed, believe me, you should. Okay, in quick summary, we lost 1 million acre feet last year, and we've lost 300,000 acre feet of storage since 15. Don't like seeing it, but that's the way it is. 2016 and 17, we did a lot of stuff. Mother Nature's helped us out a lot. But this is a long-term solution, and we're running into the dry years like we knew we would. And, you know, recharge the aquifer leaks. We got to keep going because anytime we stop, all those gains are lost. And so with that, I think I'll stand for questions.
Mike, this is Dean Stevenson. A couple of questions. As we are focused on the ESP or looking at the groundwater management area, is your information that you have available, the files available so consultants can look at that information also?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Stevens says, yeah, absolutely. This is all open information. Just have your consultants get a hold of me and I'll send them the information.
Okay. I can't see who's got their hands up. Brian, can you help me if someone has some questions?
I don't see anybody on Zoom that has their hand up, Mr. Chairman, but might ask if committee members or water board members have questions.
Mr. Chairman, Brian, this is Brian O. So Mike, I guess this question's for you, but I know, you know, being in the settlement discussions from the start, we always were hopeful that we could at some point correlate well levels to reach gains because that, you know, is real pertinent to the injury predictions and all that kind of stuff. But I've never seen a good way to do that or you know, I guess to me, we've never gotten accurate enough on it. I mean, we can measure the wells very accurately and we measure reach gains and river levels in general very inaccurately, you know, considering the value of water today. Is do you see any progress being made on that front?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Olmstead, you know, I'm just not versed in that area. I don't do a lot of work with that. And I think that maybe somebody else should try to answer those questions. I might just get myself in trouble.
That's what you're there for, Mike, to get yourself in trouble.
I don't think I heard that comment.
I don't remember is a good answer usually. That works for
That's
me.
right. I plead the fifth.
Mr. Chairman, Pat.
Go ahead, Pat.
Mike, thanks again for a great presentation. The graphs are easy to understand and your explanation makes it even easier. I just have a question because of unfamiliarity with the situation, but a lot of activity took place in what you refer to as the southwest corner. Is that because it's completely down gradient, or is that, what's the feature there? Why is it so active?
Mr. Chairman, Pat, I think a lot of it is just when we do a lot of recharge there. We do more recharge than we do in other places. And then just the aquifer properties and the distance from the river, it stays around a lot longer there. And so we kind of have the double whammy of more recharge in an area where it sticks around longer. And it does progress up towards the Great Rift there, towards that Arco to American Falls kind of cross section.
Yes, sir.
And I think you just see that. I think I cut you off, Pat.
No, thank you. You answered my question.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, this is Jeff. Just to further answer Pat's question, the board's been able to take advantage of two things in the lower valley that have increased the recharge down there, Pat. We found some very good recharge sites. We have good partners that wheel the water to those sites, and we have water available every year for recharge. Where in the upper valley, we have limited capacity to recharge, and the water isn't available every year.
Thanks, Jeff.
Any other questions from committee or water board members? Okay, any questions from other people on the call? All right.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And again, just shoot me an email or give me a call and we can exchange information or ideas.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
Okay, our next presentation will be on changes to the spring flows and reach gains from the Eastern Snake Plain Aquifer. And Ethan Geisler, also of our hydrology group, will make that presentation.
Yes, hello. My name's Ethan Geisler with the hydrology section at IWRB here. Try to get this up and running.
Go.
Should be coming up. All right, so yeah, like Brian said, I'm going to talk today about aquifer discharge in the Eastern Snake Plain Aquifer. And so just to kind of show the map again, this is the outline of the ESPA. This graph or this image shows the groundwater flow through the system. So we can see, let me get the pointer up here. You can see we have flow from northeast to southwest. And the two main areas I'm going to be focusing on are the near Blackfoot to Minidoka Reach, and then these springs that go from Milner to King Hill. And so like Mike kind of discussed already, discharge from both the springs and then also to the reach gain is controlled by water levels in the ESPA. And so when there's higher water levels in the ESPA, we see higher discharge values to both the reach gains and those springs. And so we're going to dive into each one of those. The first one we're going to dive into is the near Blackfoot to Minidoka Reach. And so the reach gain is basically the gain or loss of water between the beginning and the end of a river reach. And so how we calculate the reach gain is we take the outflow. In this case, it's going to be Minidoka. So the Snake River at Minidoka gauge that's monitored by the USGS. subtract out the inflow, which is the Snake River near Blackfoot gauge. And then we add back in the diversions. We add in any reservoir changes in content. And so any daily increase or decrease in physical content of the reservoirs are added back in. We add back in evaporative losses from the reservoir, and then we subtract out return flow and tributary flow. And what this does is it helps us isolate what's coming from the aquifer without any outside influences to that reach, such as like the Portneuf or some of those other tributaries or return flows from agriculture. And so here is the graphic that some of you are familiar with. So this is the near Blackfoot to Minidoka reach gains. We have our annual reach gain here in millions of acre feet on the y-axis. We have our annual value here on the x-axis. And you can see here from, what is that? From 2021 to 2022, we dropped about 50,000 acre feet. And that's the lowest that we've seen for this graph. So kind of just we've seen a similar pattern in the early 2000s with the drought, quite a few years of a decrease there. We're kind of seeing that same thing since 2017. So, and this kind of lines up with what Mike was showing on his storage change plot. So that upper northwest or upper northeast corner is kind of the lower storage change area. And so that kind of correlates to this near Blackfoot to Minidoka reach, more so than that southwest corner where there were maybe some gains in storage change. So this correlates relatively well to what he was showing. And I'll pause here for a second because I'm going to transition to the springs. I don't know if we want to take questions now on this while it's up or if we want to wait till the end. And I can move on to the springs.
Does anyone have any questions right now? Any committee members or board members? Okay.
All right, we'll move on. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We'll move on to the springs here. So same map. This time we're just going to look at these springs down here. And so spring discharge occurs when the groundwater table intersects the land surface or the canyon wall. And so a diagram of that lower valley where the springs discharge, we have our canyon wall here, the groundwater table in this dashed line. There's the stream flow here in the bottom, and then the springs enter where that groundwater intersects the canyon wall. Sometimes it's right at the river elevation. Sometimes it's higher up on the canyon wall. It just kind of depends on where those outputs are coming from. And so sometimes they can be difficult to measure. Sometimes they're easier to measure. So this is one spring where there's easy road access. And it's pretty unique because the flow is concentrated into a single channel. So you get down to the lower part of the stream and get a pretty good idea of the spring seepage that's coming out of that canyon wall. But there are some instances where it's almost impossible to measure spring discharge directly from the outlet. And so there's no road access in this case. There's brush in the channel. There's potential seepage into the hillside. So if you were to be able to measure this, it may be seeping in at some point or seeping out some point below here. So that makes it difficult to measure. There's also instances where it's right beside the stream, the Snake River stream bank. So this is Blue Heart Springs. You could potentially measure this in low flow in this channelized section, but at high flow, that gets inundated by the Snake River. And there could also be some underlying flow in there that you're potentially not capturing. So those are just some examples of how it's hard to measure that spring discharge. And so in 1995, there was a method developed by the USGS, the same Kellstrom gentleman that kind of did that early storage change analysis. And he used the data available at the time. And so basically it's a calculation to calculate the spring discharge in the Thousand Springs area. And what it does is it takes the actual measurements at 17 springs in March and April, so in the springtime, and then we apply statistics to the other ones that we can't measure, and then project out that year's total spring discharge based on those actual measurements and some statistical analysis. And so, like Mike said, this is what he was showing. So we have our storage change here in the line with the points on the first y-axis here. We have our discharge on the second y-axis for the Kellstrom method. And so blue bars are the calculated discharge from Thousand Springs based on that Kellstrom method. And you can see that it's tracked pretty well over time. We've gotten these drought periods pretty well tracked. The increase in around 2017. And then since then, we've been receding or declining in both the storage change and the discharge from Thousand Springs. One thing to point out is this 2023 value is preliminary because we will use the data that we're measuring. Some of that data we continue to collect through the year, and then we update that value at the end of the year. So this is a preliminary value, but it's pretty darn close. It doesn't change a whole lot. And that was about a 50 CFS drop from 2022 to 2023. And so that's another thing to point out. We are projecting the rest of 2023 in that calculation. So just something to keep in mind when you're looking at this chart. And so the springs are really important for multiple reasons. One of them is the Swan Falls Settlement Agreement and the minimum flows that go along with that. So they are the main drivers of the flow that reach that Snake River near Murphy gauge past Swan Falls Dam in the agreement that the board has with Idaho Power and the department has with Idaho Power. Some of you may be familiar with this graph. So this is the AADF calculation, and it's so I'll walk you through some of this. So discharge here on the y-axis, daily values on the x-axis. We have our minimum stream flow, which is 5,600 CFS during the non-irrigation season. So November through April, and then it drops down to 3,900 CFS from April 1st to October 31st. We keep track of the Snake River near Murphy statistical data here with the minimum of record in red and the median of record in green. The current year data for Snake River near Murphy gauge that USGS monitors here is in blue. And then we also keep track of the Milner flow here on the bottom. So just flow that's passing over Milner. It's kind of nice to see what's going on upstream of this reach. And then we have our AADF calculation, which basically takes out Idaho Power reservoir operations and then their storage water releases. And so this is going to be slightly different than the blue line, but it should be kind of smoothing out that blue line for the most part. And so some things to point out here, we were pretty low at that winter time frame, dropping below the minimum of record at times. We got some pretty good runoff events, and then that was tagged along on by adding on the Bureau of Reclamation flow augmentation. So that was included in the AADF. But now we are into Idaho Power storage water releases over Milner Dam. And so that's actually subtracted out of the AADF calculation. So that's why this blue line and the black line are starting to deviate. One silver lining may be that this black line is currently showing a little bit more above that minimum of record compared to what we were seeing in the winter. Some of that could be some of the spring discharge, but also some of the remnants from that runoff, just a little bit higher base flow that we're seeing in the summertime. So maybe something to keep an eye on as we move into the August, September time period. Maybe it'll continue to rise here. And now I'll get into each one of the springs. So we'll work our way. Some of these are monitored by the USGS. Some are monitored by our staff here at the Department of Water Resources in the hydrology section. And so I'll walk through each one of these on an annual time step, and you can see kind of the trend over time. And all of the trends are pretty similar, especially over the recent years. We have an increase in annual discharge here that's on the y-axis, and then the annual value here on the x-axis. So an increase over time, especially around or after the 2017 time period. And then over the past couple of years, we started to decline at all of these springs that we monitor. So this one is Devil's Wash Bowl, just below Milner. There's also Blue Lakes here, so an increase after 2017, and then we've been decreasing since. Not quite the lowest we've seen at Blue Lakes, but still getting low. We have Briggs Springs here monitored by the USGS. So increase over time after 2017, decrease since then. This one is Box Canyon, so pretty good indicator of spring discharge. And so we've had an increase and then a decrease. Some of you may be familiar with this graphic that I show in some of those AADF updates. So all this is discharge here on the y-axis, and then a daily time step on the x-axis. The gray lines are historical data from 1990 to 2022, with the median here in the dashed line. And then you can see the current 2023 data. We've been hovering around those minimums. Only 2015 and 2016 were lower. I think this is also a good graphic to kind of to show what Mike was talking about with some of that lag that we see in the aquifer storage change and the spring discharge. So that winter that we had was a really good winter, but it doesn't show up until maybe the fall where we start to increase those flows. And so that's just something to keep in mind. We'll be anxious to see how this comes up over time in the fall here. Here is CPAC ABC, so getting closer to Hagerman. This one is quite more variable. Some of the lowest flows that we saw on record, though, this past 2022 calendar year. This is CPAC Bridal Veil, so this is monitored by IDWR as well. And we saw a decrease since 2018. And then Current Tunnel, this one is also one of the lowest that we've seen on record. And so, yeah, they're kind of mixed, but some just basic takeaway is that the springs are declining since that high runoff event that we saw in 2017. So some of that may be just the storage change and how long it stays in the system and how quickly it moves out of the system. So, and with that, I'll stop and take any questions that you guys have on the reach gains or any of the spring discharge information.
From committee or board members.
Hey, Dean, you were breaking up there.
So, any questions from committee members or board members? Okay, I guess I have a question. Percentage of the reach gains, we talked about the two major places are the Hagerman Springs and then the ones, the Blackfoot to Neely or Blackfoot to Minidoka that we've kind of been looking at. You know, as the percentage of the water, the leaks that the aquifer gives up, which percent, I guess the question I'm asking is, what percent goes to the lower reach, the Hagerman reach, and then what percent is above that? Do you know that number right off the top of your head?
I kind of got it.
Hey, Dean, could I have you move closer to your mic? You were breaking up again there.
Okay, am I better now?
Maybe I kind of got, let me reiterate the question, see if that's what you're asking. So are you asking the percentage of contribution from the near Blackfoot to Minidoka? What percent is that of the total if you were to combine Thousand Springs discharge and near Blackfoot to Minidoka?
Yeah, or from, yeah, probably, I guess, the reach gains above Minidoka versus the reach gains below Minidoka.
Yeah, and I'm not sure I have those numbers readily available. We could definitely look into that. I'm not sure the percentage breakout or what magnitude for each above and below Minidoka would be. But if that's yeah, we could definitely look into that, and I can get back to you.
Thank you. Any other questions? All right.
Hey,
Just a
Travis has a question.
Dean, before we move on, if you are entertaining questions from non-board members?
Yes, I am.
Travis Thompson looks like he has a question.
Thanks, Chairman Stevenson. Ethan, could you go back to that Minidoka, the Blackfoot to Minidoka slide? And did you have a total volume? Was that an annual volume change? Is that 21 to 22?
Yes, 21 to 22. And this was about 140 or 1.4, and this is about 1.35 roughly million acre feet.
1.4 million acre feet change from which year to which year?
So it was 1.4 million acre feet in 2021,
Okay,
and it is 1.35 million acre feet in 2022.
just a decrease from the prior year. Is that?
Yes, yeah,
Okay.
yep.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
so this is total annual flow, but in millions of acre feet. Yep.
Okay, I was just curious about the changes in between years, if those going from like 20 to 21 and 21 to 22. I guess I can sort of see it.
Yeah, so this was about 50,000 acre feet change this past year, and then, yeah, probably 1.55 to 1.4, so 150,000 acre feet
Okay,
in the previous.
thank you.
Yep.
Any other questions from non-board members? All right, we can move on to the next presentation.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, next we'll have a report on ESPA settlement agreement activities from Brian Reagan of the Department of Water Resources.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Brian Reagan, and I work in the water distribution section, which is part of the Water Compliance Bureau here at the Department of Water Resources. Thanks for the opportunity to present to you today. I'll take about 10 minutes to talk about two topics: mitigation plan compliance and groundwater levels and select monitoring wells within the Eastern Snake Plain Aquifer boundary. During the first half of my presentation, I'll provide an update of mitigation activities undertaken in 2022 by members of the signatory cities and by groundwater districts as required by their separate mitigation plans with the Surface Water Coalition. In general, these two mitigation plans require a reduction in groundwater pumping or mitigation activities, or a combination of both. The department's role is to conduct an unbiased third-party review of the annual progress report submitted by both parties and report on the findings. I'll conclude my presentation by showing results of groundwater level measurements collected from 20 pre-selected monitoring wells across the East Snake Plain. The groundwater levels in these 20 sentinel wells serve as an indicator metric of the aquifer's response to groundwater withdrawals and mitigation activities. The department's role as it relates to this topic is to collect, store, and publish the groundwater level data. So first, data from the cities. There are currently 28 cities that participate in the stipulated mitigation plan with the Surface Water Coalition. The annual mitigation requirement for these cities typically takes the form of aquifer recharge, but their agreement allows for other mitigation activities. In 2022, the cities conducted aquifer recharge, completed groundwater to surface water conversion projects, and delivered wet water. These combined mitigation activities totaled 7,631.1 acre feet, and this satisfies their annual mitigation requirement. The cities are also required to maintain a 5-year rolling mitigation average of at least 7,650 acre feet starting in 2024. This 5-year average currently sits at 7,816.1 acre feet. Moving from the cities to the Idaho groundwater appropriators, the next two slides will show a comparison of IGWA and department-derived volumes for 2022 activities and an annual side-by-side comparison summary of these volumes since 2016. IGWA mitigates by reducing their groundwater pumping and by conducting mitigation activities such as aquifer recharge and delivering wet water to the Surface Water Coalition. IGWA combines their pumping reductions and mitigation volumes together and reports them as total conservation. IGWA is required to achieve an annual total conservation volume of 240,000 acre-feet. IGWA compiles and submits data for each category shown as rows in the table above. Then the department compiles its own data for each category. The results are then compared to determine how similar or different the data sets are. So looking at the slide now, the data in blue is from IGWA, data in orange is from the department, and the white column is the percent difference of the department data relative to IGWA's data. So just walking through the calculations quickly. Let's see if I can do that trick Ethan did with changing his pointer. That was pretty neat. How'd you do that, Ethan? Pointer options. Oh. Laser pointer. Thank you. So there we go. The 5-year baseline is the sum of the average use between 2010 and 2014 of all the wells that are members of the groundwater districts that comprise IGWA. We then subtract the annual usage to get the annual reduction amount. We then add any mitigation or recharge that occurred, getting the total conservation volumes. That volume is then compared to their 240,000 acre-feet annual requirement. My next slide will show how the IGWA and department data sets have compared since this data was first reported in 2016. There we go. So on the y-axis, we have acre-feet. On the x-axis, we have year, but notice there are side-by-side data sets submitted by IGWA and the department. I also have the 240,000 acre-feet threshold shown in red. The various colors, the blue are the pumping reduction volumes, and added on top are the mitigation amounts. My final slide is a plot of the groundwater level index from the 20 Sentinel wells between 1981 and 2003, along with benchmarks listed in the IGWA Surface Water Coalition term sheet. The groundwater level index is a single composite data point generated each year and is compiled from groundwater levels collected each spring from 20 wells across the ESPA during the months of March and April. These wells were selected by the Surface Water Coalition and IGWA and serve as a metric to evaluate the response of the East Snake Plain Aquifer to inputs and withdrawals. The inset map shows the spatial distribution of the 20 Sentinel wells as green dots. The groundwater level index in feet is along the x-axis, and years are along groundwater level index in feet are on the y-axis, and years are along the x-axis. This graph is used to show relative changes, and it's worth noting that the value of 0 on the y-axis really has no meaning here. So shown on the graph in yellow is the 2023 groundwater level index of -8.97 feet. Also shown is the previous 2022 value in orange, the historic indices in blue, and the benchmark goals agreed to by the parties in green. The 2023 is a benchmark year, which was not met. The overall goal to be achieved by 2026 is to restore groundwater levels in the aquifer equivalent to the average groundwater level index between the years 1991 and 2001. This target is plus 0.93 feet. So in other words, the goal is to raise the groundwater level index over 9.5 feet between 2020 and 2026. So relative to last year's 2022 groundwater level index of -7.62 feet, the 2023 value of -8.97 feet represents a decrease and the groundwater level index of 1.35 feet. Well, that concludes my presentation. Thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to field any questions if there are any.
Any questions from committee or water board members? Any questions from other guests? All right.
Okay, moving on to our next presentation. We'll have a presentation from Alex Moody of our hydrology group here at the department on aquifer impacts resulting from recharge, pumping reductions, and other management activities.
Thank you, Brian. My name is Alex Moody. As Brian mentioned, I work for the hydrology section here at IDWR. I'm going to give you an update on modeled impacts resulting from managed aquifer recharge. Brief outline of my presentation. First, I'll go over how we put these recharge and mitigation efforts into ESPAM 2.2, the current version of the groundwater model. The second, we'll be looking at some numbers output by the model in terms of reach gains and aquifer storage impacts. And then the last will be time to bring out the popcorn. I've got some movies on what these impacts look like as far as water level changes across the SPA. All right, so very basically, the model runs on monthly time steps, and I have to take the data that were given from board recharge, the IGWA and progress reports in terms of recharge and pumping reductions, and either sum them to monthly or distribute annual volumes in terms of the pumping reductions into monthly values. So these can add some limitations, mainly for the pumping reductions, because we don't know when in time these are actually happening, but I distribute them evenly throughout the irrigation season. Looking at the model grid, we have 1 by 1 mile grid cells that these stresses, I'll call them stresses, but recharge and pumping reductions are applied to in cubic feet. And this is how we distribute them based on the information we're given from, in this case, the board and IGWA recharge. So we're seeing colors here on a log scale in terms of acre feet. And this is all totaled since 2015 to present day. And I'll be showing the aquifer or the modeled boundary as Mike did. This is pumping reductions. Not everything's positive, but luckily the positive pumping reduction magnitude is greater than that negative value. But these are kind of what the model is seeing as total stresses or inputs into the model. All right, so after running the model, we get some outputs. This graph shows a few things up at the top. These are total volumes of inputs into the model, parsed out by board recharge in blue, IGWA and city recharge in red, and then pumping reductions in purple. So that y-axis on the top plot is thousands of acre feet on a monthly time step. The second plot are impacts to above Milner reach gains in CFS for the same entities. Again, board is blue, IGWA and city recharge is red, and then purple is pumping reductions. For the current year, we're seeing that pumping reductions are having the greatest impact above Milner, adding about 100 CFS to reach gains up there, and IGWA recharge and board recharge are having a somewhat similar effect, around maybe 80 CFS. In the third plot, this is below Milner reach gains. Board recharge activities are having an impact about 100 CFS, and IGWA total conservation are both coming in around maybe 10 to 20 CFS below Milner. The last plot is, I think, a good story. This is cumulative change to storage since aquifer activity, recharge activities have occurred. So that we've added about 2.17 million acre feet to aquifer storage since the beginning of all these programs. Getting into a little bit finer detail in terms of reach gains. Here we're looking at above near Blackfoot. The left axis is acre feet. That will correspond with the grid lines. And then on the right is that same amount at a rate of CFS. So we're seeing above near Blackfoot that pumping reductions are having the greatest impact. The rates of decline for board recharge and pumping reductions are a little bit lower than IGWA recharge. And I'm just kind of talking about the slope of these lines here. So we'll see these are kind of asymptoting a little more quickly than the IGWA recharge. Near Blackfoot to Minidoka, most gains have been decreasing over the past few years from IGWA recharge and pumping reductions. However, I thought this was pretty interesting. We're seeing board recharge steadily increase in this reach. It's close to 40 CFS. Below in Milner, board recharge is having the greatest impact at around 100 CFS. And then looking at impacts to storage, the top plot is total storage contents. Total inputs into storage. The colors are a little bit different here. The second plot is IGWA recharge. The past few years, we've been losing from storage any inputs from prior IGWA recharge activities. The third plot, we have board recharge. And the last one is storage change due to pumping reductions, which you'll see kind of artifacts of how we put the pumping reductions in the model. It's just one consistent volume to sum up to the total annual pumping reduction. That's why we have that plateaued look on a year-to-year basis. One point to make is how board and IGWA recharge kind of complement each other as far as timing. Board recharge is going into storage while IGWA recharge is releasing into reach gains and vice versa. This plot is showing you how much of aquifer management activities have remained in storage relative to how much we've put in. So we have about 58% of board recharge remaining in storage aquifer-wide. Pumping reductions, we have about 50%. And then IGWA and city recharge, there's about 27% remaining in storage. All right, this is a bit of a wild plot, but what I did here was run the model in pulses, where each pulse was a year of recharge from July to June. That kind of made the best curve of, starting with small volumes and had a nice peak. So each color is a year. I ran the model out to 2036 and looked at what was still in storage. The black line outlining the top of all these colors is that total cumulative storage we saw in the first graph looking at the impacts, where it's saying about 2.17 million acre feet remains in storage. The main point I'm making here is these, every year these impacts are building on one another. The results stack and remain in the aquifer for a long time. So looking, 10, 12 years out, there's still water remaining in storage that we put in from this past decade. Here we see the Sentinel Well Index that Brian just presented. Those green dots are, again, the benchmarks. This is what we're sitting at with the observed water levels in the Sentinel wells. If we subtract off how much the model shows recharge activities impacting heads in the aquifer, we see we would have been a lot worse off. I'm estimating in 2023, we would be about 4.3 feet lower, or I'm saying here, so we're doing about 4.3 feet better in terms of the Sentinel Well Index than we would have been without recharge or pumping reductions. So again, each line represents different kind of components of that, all adding up to total mitigation and conservation at that green line. So while we're not hitting the benchmarks, we could have been down here around negative 13.5 versus where we are today. And I'm going to move into movies now. So if anyone would like to look at any of those graphs more closely or has any questions up to now, I could take them.
Any questions from committee members or board members? All right, I think I have a question. If we go back a couple of slides to the difference between the state recharge water and the IWRB recharge. I don't remember how many slides back. Okay, yeah, that one right there.
The storage retention. Yeah, let me.
Yeah, so is the reason for retention longer, is it because of the state's location they've been doing recharge, Lower Valley?
You're asking if the reason for the higher retention with the board recharge, is that due to the location, or sorry, the location of the sites? Yeah. So the board recharge sites are further from the river and do have longer retention times. So we don't see them returning to the stream as quickly. The volumes, in the past few years have definitely, are typically higher than big well recharge as well.
Thank you. Any other questions from other guests or board members?
Mr. Chairman, Dean, Alex, this is Brian O. I don't know how to answer this question, but we, we can model how much we do managed recharge and how much we can do in reductions and all those things, but it almost seemed, and we know that it's a catch-22, but we're also, we help finance conservation measures all over the place, and a lot of those conservation measures are to increase efficiency on canals and water conveyance, but yet that directly, incidental recharge is probably a bigger factor on everything than the managed recharge by far, but we don't get to see how much incidental recharge are we losing each year? Because I think it's a big elephant in the room, and you know, I totally, you know, I'm on the board. We finance a lot of conservation, but at some point we need canal losses, we need losses in conveyance, or we can't make up for that much with our managed stuff. So is there any thoughts about ever modeling changes in incidental recharge, or is that just an impossible thing to swallow?
Well, I would say to that, you know, the model, part of building the model is, you know, a water budget that takes into account what we know about, you know, incidental recharge, either from, you know, excess precipitation or excess irrigation water. So we have an idea, you know, and from measurements of the springs, you know, what's leaving the aquifer. But yeah, I wouldn't say necessarily could fully, you know, just subtract these impacts and say that everything else is from incidental, but that might be a question above my pay grade at this point. But it's an interesting and an important question. I think we're all grappling with that.
Well, I understand it's just a hard one to answer. I mean, the board, we wrestle with it all the time, and we know how much each project we do is going to save in water loss, but if we're saving it from being lost to the aquifer, then it's just a tough one. I don't know what to do either. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? All right, I think we'll move on to our next presentation.
Sorry, there was a last part of my presentation where we're gonna look at some animations of model outputs. So.
I knew that.
Okay, so the first animation I'd like to show is actual observed data. These are going to be changes since spring of 2016 based on water levels from our groundwater monitoring network that Mike showed earlier. These incorporate about 309 wells. 214 of these have transducers at some point during this animation. The number of transducers grow as we get to more recent dates. 95 have hand measurements that have at least 4 measurements per year. So those, I just made linear interpolations. So this is on a weekly time step. We're looking at the ESPA aquifer model boundary. The red points are recharge sites. They're not all of them. It's an older file that was going in there, but I'll just hit play. So again, this is changes from April 2016 in terms of water levels. Blue is increases in water level and brown is decreases. And this isn't going to parse out, natural and incidental recharge from aquifer recharge impacts. But this is just kind of something to look at first before we go into the modeled head changes. We're gaining, aquifer levels mainly went up largely until 2019. Some increases in 2020. We're starting to get some areas of drawdowns in the brown over by Henry's Fork. A lot of these are seasonal. So we're getting into 2023 now. And yeah, we stop in 2023 of March. After that, the data coverage is kind of makes the interpolation a little weird. I will add, these aren't the same. I don't use the same method to fill in the gaps as Mike does. This is a little less robust, as I'm making about 400 of these more for illustration purposes. We'll move on to the modeled water level impacts. This is from board recharge. Most of it happens in the southwest area, so we'll see water level increases down here. These are monthly time steps, so we're moving a little faster. You know, there's some, earlier on there was some recharge up here. The biggest thing I take away from this is this front moving up valley. I'll play it again. You know, as we continue to recharge consistently every year, the impacts will grow. You know, they stick around the lower valley initially, and then this 5-foot contour, you know, really start moving up. And if you recall that plot on the near Blackfoot to Minidoka gains, we saw that in the reach gains still slightly increasing in this year, trending upwards versus trending downwards. All right, now switching to IGWA recharge. The first few years there wasn't much, so that's why we haven't seen, you know, that started off pretty neutral, but see the spatial location where recharge is happening, much more in the upper valley. These contours are a little smaller. These only go from 10 to negative 10 feet. So we're recharging, but again, you can see it's pretty close to the river. And then it's decreasing. All right. And this is pumping reductions. Same scale as the last one. It's going to be a little bit more widespread. Some areas you'll see negative impacts, as we saw earlier. Not all areas had pumping reductions. All right. My last animation here, on the left, we saw this. That was the first movie I showed of observed water level changes since 2016. On the right, we have this kind of ternary 3-point color scale where I'm subtracting off the modeled impacts of any given, you know, either board recharge or IGWA and total conservation from the observed water level changes to get an idea of what's causing those observed water levels we're changing. I'm sorry, observed changes we see. So yellow is going to be mainly due to natural or incidental recharge. Blue, that's board recharge. The pink is going to be IGWA and private recharge, and as well as pumping reductions. So you see the blue really coming out over by milepost 31, Devil's Head Gate. Pumping reductions are pretty widespread throughout the ESPA. So we start to see more, you know, it's not just yellow as we go forward, causing these changes. And you know, this isn't exactly quantitative, it's more of a technique just to illustrate, you know, where, you know, based on what the model says and what we observed, if we compare those, what might be causing those water level changes. And some conclusions I had from that, I think the big one is Sentinel well index, we're sitting about 4.3 feet higher due to aquifer management today. The second one, you know, there's some years we're gonna do better. 2019 to 2020, we had a lot of recharge, and that's the largest portion making up storage these days. But if you look back to that multicolored plot, you know, all years still are showing an impact. And we've added about 2.17 million acre feet to storage since the programs began, and about 2.26 million acre feet to reach gains, you know, have been seen at the river since the start of the program due to activities. So that's all I've got. And if there's any further questions or anyone would like to, I don't know if we have time to look at the movies again, but happy to answer those.
Any questions from board members or committee members? Okay, any other folks in the meeting have any other questions? Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation.
Thanks, Alex.
Okay, next we will actually move into another aquifer and talk about the Treasure Valley Aquifer. Craig Tesh will talk about using the new Treasure Valley groundwater model and some proposed aquifer recharge scenarios that will be running for the board.
All right, well, thanks, Brian. Good afternoon, members of the committee. As Brian said, my name is Craig Tesh and I manage the groundwater group and hydrology section. Before we move on to the Treasure Valley, I just wanted to say, Mike McVeigh said earlier that our ESPA monitoring network was beautiful, and that was one of the greatest compliments our group could probably get. So I'll make sure Dennis hears that. I thought that was pretty neat. So I've been working on this project you see in front of you for the last couple of months with Brown and Caldwell, and consulting with Jennifer Succo and Wesley Hipke. And this project, as Brian said, will utilize the new Treasure Valley groundwater model to evaluate potential managed aquifer recharge scenarios in the valley. We're in the process of finalizing our plans, and I'm at a decision point. So I would appreciate any input or guidance from you all today, and thank you for having me to walk you through this. So on this title page, there are three images. These are some of the products that led to this work. On the left is the hydrogeologic framework report that was produced by the USGS, which was served as the conceptual foundation for the modeling efforts. In the middle is a brochure that the USGS put together for the model itself. And then on the right is the 2020 feasibility study, is a figure from the 2020 feasibility study, which I'll be talking about here in a little bit. There are some weird symbols on there instead of my. Okay, what is that about?
It's your PDF version.
Sorry, hold on one second. This is the PDF.
Yeah.
Should I just run through that?
Just.
Okay. All right, sorry about that. Some fonts didn't come over. First, I'll give you a timeline of our efforts leading to this work. In June 2017, the Department of Water Resources and the board entered into a collaboration with the USGS to construct a new groundwater flow model for the valley. The Water Resource Board funded the project. It was a 5-year project. The USGS was responsible for building that model, and they built that upon the steady state Treasure Valley hydrologic project model. And IDWR chaired the modeling technical advisory committees for stakeholder input, and Sean Vincent chaired those committees, and we had 18 committee meetings over a 5-year period. In January 2020, the hydrogeologic framework was completed, and as I said earlier, that formed the conceptual basis for the model. A few months later, the recharge feasibility study that was led by Wesley Hipke and his group was completed by Brown and Caldwell. And that took a look at locations in the Treasure Valley that had high and low potential for recharge. And so that study was a completely separate venture from the groundwater modeling effort. So I just want that to be clear. Those are two different things, but that 2020 Brown and Caldwell study is the starting point for the work that I'm talking about today. It's the foundation we're building off of. And when they completed that study in March of 2020, they did not have the Treasure Valley groundwater model to use to run any of the scenarios that they proposed. In January 2023, this year, as everyone knows, the groundwater flow model was completed and released. And then that leads us to today. A couple months back in May, we entered into an agreement with Brown and Caldwell to begin modeling recharge scenarios with the new model. So because the 2020 study was our starting point, I wanted to give you some background on that. And what you see here is one of the final products from that report. On the left side, you can see the outline of the Treasure Valley in gray. Oh, now I don't get the pointer. Oh, that's all right. You can see the outline of the Treasure Valley in gray, and you can see the location of Boise here, just to kind of ground you where you're at. And they took that Treasure Valley boundary and they divided it up into 1 mile by 1 mile cells, and they assigned scores to those cells based on the 8 factors on the right, and then they assign colors based on those scores, with areas that are more green, more favorable to recharge, and areas that are more red, less favorable to recharge. So you can see Zone 6 was an area with a lot of green, and that is really the focus of our work and the focus of a lot of stakeholder interest. So we'll be talking about that area. Once they had that GIS model built, Brown and Caldwell took a look at water availability, infrastructure cost, and came up with a variety of scenarios of how to get water to those different areas, primarily Zone 6, like I mentioned here, this green square, and then Zone 3 up here. Just want you to keep in mind, these are not the groundwater model scenarios. These are just feasibility scenarios. So I'll walk you through their 6 scenarios they came up with, starting up at the top here. It's kind of a tan line taking water from the Payette up and over to Zone 3. There were 2 different scenarios there with different flow rates. Coming down to the New York Canal, scenario 3 was this red line here, bringing water using existing infrastructure to that green square. Scenario 4 is bringing water over here near the diversion dam with a new pipeline to that green square. Scenario 5 is this purple line starting over here down valley and on the Boise River down by Caldwell and bringing it all the way across the valley to that green square. The point with that one is that is an area where water is available all year round. So that's the variable there. That's a little different than the other ones where there's only water available at certain times of the year. And then the last scenario was bringing water up from the Snake, this blue line here. And so, like I mentioned, we're focusing on Zone 6. We're focusing really on those 4 southern scenarios. With that background, here are the details and major components of our contract we entered into a couple months ago with Brown and Caldwell. The main components are first order of business was to update those GIS layers, that map I showed earlier. That 2020 GIS model that they built relied on old data. The new update, which you can see on the right, is using data from the new Treasure Valley model. This one on the right is hot off the presses. We just got it at the end of last week, so it's very preliminary. I didn't want to scrutinize it too much, but if you look at it, not too many surprises here. We hypothesized that it wouldn't change too much. I think the green area in zone 6 grew a little bit, but it's basically the same. Step 2 in this work is developing the work plan, which is what we're currently working on, and part of that is being here today to seek your input on the model scenarios that we're going to run, and then we're going to finalize this plan, and then go to step 3, which is running the Treasure Valley model, having Brown and Caldwell's modelers run the model, and then by May of next year having a final report that shows what the effects on groundwater levels would be for each of those scenarios, river flow, river gains, drain discharge, aquifer interactions, how the aquifer interacts with Lake Lowell, New York Canal, those type of things. So determining those 6 to 8 scenarios is what this is all about, and we're there. I'm trying here. There we go. So this is that map I showed earlier with the 6 scenarios from Brown and Caldwell on there, with 3 additional, those blue callouts are things I've added to the map. And sorry, this was supposed to be animated and it's not. So we are proposing first and foremost to do those 4 Brown and Caldwell scenarios. Scenario 3, which is coming right off the canal with existing infrastructure. Scenario 4, which is a pipeline from the Boise River. Scenario 5, which is from the Boise River but down valley with water available all year. Scenario 6, again, is from the Snake. And then the 5th scenario we are proposing is, you can see my mouse here, the New York Canal lining project, which is a project that I understand is moving forward, and that is lining the canal for 6 miles from diversion dam to about the airport. And so that project would have an effect on the aquifer system. So we need to model that and determine how it affects the other scenarios and some of the work we're doing here. The 6th scenario we are proposing is doing managed recharge in the southeast Boise groundwater management area. We don't know exactly where. That's something Jennifer and I have to figure out, is where to put the dot on there. But we thought, that's an area of concern. It's a groundwater management area, and we'd like to see what it does to the water levels in that area. And then the 7th scenario we are proposing is due to stakeholder input. There's been a lot of interest in whether or not Hubbard Reservoir would be a good location to do managed recharge. It is fairly close to that green square, but it is 3 to 4 miles away, about 4 miles. It is north of the canal, but it is close to that boundary to the next zone, which Brown and Caldwell did call out as an area of shallow groundwater. And it is closer, it's closer to the city. So I think it'd be an interesting one to run. And the last scenario is undetermined and at the discretion of the board. And I'd like to get any thoughts on if there's something someone is considering. We do have some ideas we could throw around on that one. We could run that scenario 1, bringing water up and over from the Payette. We could look at some near Lake Lowell, but a lot of those have pretty tough practical issues with getting water there. So I wonder if I could zoom in just a little bit. With that, that is actually all I had. Wanted the focus to be on this map. And I stand for any questions or input or guidance on this.
Question from committee or board members?
The Chairman, Al Barker. I've got a few, if I could, if you would indulge me. With, so I want to start off with the canal lining project. I think, first of all, it doesn't really start at diversion dam. It starts that at the Amity crossing by Barber Dam. But but what's been happening, to my understanding, is that Reclamation has been evaluating that issue as part of its environmental assessment for the New York Canal lining project. And I'm just wondering what level of coordination there is, what the effect of running a New York Canal lining project impact study after the environmental assessment's already done, which evaluates the same thing. What is that going to do? I mean, anyway, how do we mesh those two things together? And if Reclamation's already doing it, why do we need to do it?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Barker, good question, good observation. We did meet earlier this year with Bureau, and they presented some preliminary results. I don't think we have those in hand. Jennifer's here. I might have a quick discussion here. Jennifer, I don't know if you want to weigh in. Is this lining scenario something we need to have in place when we look at the other scenarios? It is a change to the system. Is it something we run as a scenario, or is it something that we just take into account? So, sorry about that, Al. I got away from the mic there a little bit.
Oh, I heard you.
Well, I mean, if you are interested in knowing whether or not you can offset those impacts, then you would need to run it. But if you're only interested in the impacts of the recharge itself, and you're not interested in what the impacts of the New York Canal lining project are, then you don't need to run it. I think when we included it, we had assumed that there was an interest in knowing whether or not, how much those impacts were and whether or not they could be offset by managed recharge. If that's not the interest, then we would not need to run the canal line project.
Correct. That was my understanding, is what would the impacts be? How could we offset them, and how could we?
Yeah, well, I guess my point is, my impression, and I haven't seen anything that Reclamation has done, is that that's what they were trying to do, is determine the impacts of the canal lining project. And I think they were suggesting that, and I'm going to get this wrong, but the cells are pretty large, and that this is a pretty discrete section, that it may not, the model may not be able to tell us a lot. I mean, am I misinterpreting what Reclamation is telling me?
Either one of you want to answer that one?
I want to rely on Mike's answer. I don't want to get myself in trouble here.
Well, again, and we don't have Reclamation here, so I'm kind of talking about things that I'm hearing second and third hand through conversations with other people at Reclamation. So it just seems like before we start doing work, we ought to at least look at what somebody else has done and see if we agree with it or disagree with it, or see if we need to do something more beyond what they've already done.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Barker, I think that's a good idea. We can follow up on the meeting we had last, I don't remember when that meeting was, Sean, if that was this year at some point, and we can coordinate with them and see what they're seeing and whether this would be something that would work.
Yeah, and if there's information that we have that Reclamation can use, I think we ought to make sure that they have it too. So anyway, I think it would be helpful to touch bases with Reclamation again, just because it has, I think they just now are in the process of, or maybe concluding their evaluation. And I don't think in the spring they had any information yet to share. And they still haven't shared the actual data with anybody that I know of. So thank you for checking with them.
Yep.
Can I follow up with a different topic, Mr. Chairman, if
Go ahead, Al.
So the idea with the intake location is that recharge would be accomplished by using the New York Canal. Is that what I understand, or do I understand that correctly?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Barker, are you specifically talking about, did you say scenario 3 or just the general
Your
idea?
blue dot, yeah, your blue dot says,
Yeah.
yeah, intake location. So I guess if we're going to recharge at that green region there, you're going to need to pull water out of the New York Canal, and the canal is pretty well spoken for much of the year, and that's going to affect our ability to use it for recharge projects. I guess that's true in all the situations where we use other people's canals, but there's not a lot of excess room in the New York Canal, particularly during the irrigation season, and maybe available in the non-irrigation season, early season when they're running water to Lake Lowell. But I think during the irrigation season, you're going to have a hard time finding space to do any recharge.
Mr. Barker, yeah, the 2020 report, it just flat out assumed that diversion off the canal using existing infrastructure. If I have let me see if I can find that. You can see this table here. This was the period of water availability for each of those scenarios. So scenario 3 was September through April, and I think they just assumed natural flow for that.
Yeah. So, as with the New York Canal lining project and with other things, they shut down the canal between October and December to do work on the canal. So it's typically not going to be available for recharge in that part of the year. So that may be an overestimate of the time available for the New York Canal to deliver water. But again, I don't know what the numbers, what the amounts would, amount of water would make a difference. But I think typically the late winter, early spring is the time that there's space and canal availability. And then that we're in the question, sorry, that was just an observation. The other question I had was, you mentioned that there's an area south of Lake Lowell if you go down to your chart. And there have been entities who have proposed pumping water out of the Snake River below Swan Falls up to Lake Lowell. And so and I believe that the groundwater is in decline south of Lake Lowell. So is there some opportunity to pump water put it in the ground south of Lake Lowell, not rather than, but maybe in competition with the proposals to run water to Lake Lowell from the Snake? I know that's not something that Brown and Caldwell proposed whenever that was 3 years ago. But I wonder if that's not something worth looking at, because there's a whole lot of fractured basalt down there, and water can disappear pretty fast.
Well, we definitely have room to model that and test that out. We have been looking at water levels south of Lake Lowell, and I checked with Dennis Owsley before the meeting, and I think water levels are actually pretty stable south of Lake Lowell. There's a pretty big seasonal change, but over the long run, it looks like it's pretty good in that area. But we can definitely model that. We have one more scenario left.
Well, I think it's something to consider. I don't know if it's the right thing to consider, but it's something to think about, to look at and say, is that something we want to take a look at of putting water in that area?
Mr. Barker, how do you feel about scenario 1 and 2, bringing water over from the pad? Is that just kind of let that be?
Well, I can tell you that with the development north of Eagle, that's probably something we should look at. I mean, last time I drove up through Highway 55, there was a whole lot more houses than the time before.
Mhm. Well, I think those are two good scenarios to look at, the Payette River scenario and the Lake Lowell one, and I'll get together with Jennifer and
Yeah.
and talk it over.
I think there's starting to be some concern in the Payette about whether or not they're reaching the limits of their water availability, but clearly the Payette's got water that other basins don't, so it's probably something to look at. I guess one other thing, observation I remember that about Hubbard was that there is a lot of shallow groundwater to the north and west of there that seem to have been enhanced whenever water was put into Hubbard, because it doesn't really hold water all that well, but it ends up in the drains, and in the very shallow groundwater didn't seem to go deep when they had occasion to put water in Hubbard. So it's probably worth doing a more investigation, but I think we might find we're going to just enhance the perched aquifer and not do a whole lot for the groundwater, at least from the historic evidence that we've seen.
I agree, and Brown and Caldwell specifically called that out as well, the shallow groundwater right there. So I think it'd be interesting to run that one.
Yeah, it's worth finding out, that's for sure.
Mhm. And that's one thing we were thinking about with this whole thing is, regardless of the infrastructure, we have a whole bunch of different variables to test and just to see how groundwater levels respond. And so I think some of these are just a good exercise.
Always better to have data than not.
Definitely.
Mr. Chairman, this is Jeff Raybould.
Go ahead, Jeff.
I agree with Al. I don't think we need to study the impacts from the New York Canal lining right now. I think we can just assume there'll be some impacts. But what we want to look at is how much aquifer enhancement we can accomplish with any of these projects. So if we don't cover the New York Canal lining project, does that allow us to study two more scenarios, or is there only one more scenario that you're looking for input on?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Raybould, if we drop the New York Canal lining project as a scenario, that would give us two, so we could look at possibly the Lake Lowell and the Payette River one, but it gives us two.
Okay, that would be my suggestion, Mr. Chairman, is that we've just focused on recharge projects for the time being. We've got a while to see how quickly the lining progresses and then determine what impacts are going to come from that lining into the future. We know we need to do some recharge and we want to get ahead of the curve. So we should be focusing on potential recharge sites at this time.
Is there any more questions? I guess I have one. I don't remember if I heard it brought up, but what would a supply of water look like? We obviously have to get a water right for this recharge, right? But has anybody looked at what may be potentially available in the Boise and Fayette rivers?
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, I couldn't make that out. Your microphone's breaking up.
Sorry, I think it's probably my internet.
Okay.
So I think what the chairman is asking is, what's the water supply available to accomplish recharge? How often is there going to be water available if we do have recharge opportunities? Is there going to be water to put in the pits or the sites that we select?
Mr. Chairman, from my knowledge, all I can do is point at this table that Brown and Caldwell used in their evaluation of water availability. It's a little bit beyond me at that point.
Yeah, and so one thing to think about is, does the Anderson Rays and or the Cat Creek project and or the Elmore County project affect the availability of water for recharge? It's probably something we should eventually get to.
I would agree with that. All right, is any more questions? All right, do we have any other items? Is there anything left on the agenda, Brian?
You're at other items that board members may have, Mr. Chairman.
Is there any other items that this committee members would like to bring up?
Pat McMahon, nothing here, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, Brian here. I thought it was a great meeting. Only suggestion I'd have, instead of popcorn with next one of these meetings, let's have champagne.
So we're not going to have champagne with those results. To have a better water year to have champagne, Brian.
Okay,
nothing.
whiskey then, Al. Whiskey with no ice. Thanks, Dean. Good meeting.
Mr. Chairman, before you adjourn, Director Spackman's also in the room, and you might ask if he has any comments.
Mr. Spackman, do you have any comments? He's been hiding off camera.
This is Gary Spackman. I have just one question, and Ethan Geisler and I talked this morning, and I think it might be worth some discussion about what's happening with reach gains in the near Blackfoot to Minidoka reach right now, which I think is a pressing issue. And maybe I'm opening a can of worms, but you know, there's some things that are happening out there, and it would seem to me that the board would be interested in that subject. But Ethan?
Yeah, so Gary and I talked, and I think James had talked yesterday to a group of folks here at IWR about flows at the near Blackfoot to Minidoka reach dropping or being low this year. And so we pulled up, I think, the Minidoka gauge and the Neely gauge, and there was a drop in the Neely gauge of 1,000 CFS, I think, but I'm not sure if that was releases out of American Falls or if that was a shift from the USGS. James Seffel had said the USGS was heading out that way, so maybe something to keep an eye on as we move through the July and August time period when natural flow is pretty important to that reach.
Is there anything anybody else would like to bring up? I'd like to thank all those who presented here today. And appreciate all the work you put into this. The presentations were very, very good, so appreciate that. If nothing else, I guess are we ready to adjourn, Brian?
I think you need a motion to adjourn, Mr. Chairman.
For a motion to adjourn.
I'll make that motion, Mr. Chairman. Pat McMahon.
Second by Brian.
Moved and seconded. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All right, we stand adjourned. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks all.
Yeah, thanks for being willing to spend a couple of hours talking about this right after you get back from 2 days in North Idaho talking about water. So I appreciate it.
Thanks, Brian.
Thanks.